There's a name that echoes through millennia, a single word that has shaped human curiosity for over 2,000 years. Atlantis. Most people know it exists somewhere in the realm of legend, filed alongside mythology and ancient fantasy. But few have truly considered why. Why, among countless stories from antiquity, tales of heroes and gods and lost kingdoms, why does this one persist? Why does it refuse to fade into the obscurity that claimed so many others? The answer begins with a man named Plato, sitting in Athens around 360 BC, making a deliberate choice about what to write. He wasn't telling a story for casual entertainment. He was a philosopher, a serious thinker concerned with truth and justice, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. Yet he wrote about a civilization he claimed existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. He described it with remarkable specificity and detail: concentric rings of land and water, extraordinary military power, a people so advanced, so magnificent, that they seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Then, in a single day and night, they vanished beneath the sea. What makes this narrative different from every other ancient tale is what Plato did next. He didn't present it as mere myth. He didn't frame it as allegory or philosophical exercise. Instead, he grounded it deliberately in credibility. He mentioned his ancestor, Solon. He referenced Egyptian priests who allegedly maintained detailed records of this civilization. He described a war between Atlanteans and ancient Athens as if documenting established history. He placed it within the world we recognize, connecting legend to documented reality, fiction to fact. For centuries, this ambiguity created a lasting opening. Scholars argued fiercely about what Plato was actually doing. Was he recording genuine history? Was he creating an elaborate philosophical thought experiment? Was he drawing from real memories that had survived through countless retellings, filtered and transformed until they became something both wondrous and impossible? Nobody could agree. And that uncertainty, that tantalizing space between fact and fiction, became the fuel for an obsession that would consume explorers, scientists, mystics, and ordinary people across the globe. The story escaped academia entirely. It spread through culture like whispered rumors across generations. People wrote novels about it. Filmmakers imagined it. Explorers launched expeditions searching for physical proof. Even today, billions know the name Atlantis. Most couldn't explain why it matters. Most couldn't say with confidence whether it ever truly existed, yet they know it. The name alone carries weight, as if it's carrying a message from somewhere deep in human memory. And perhaps that's the real mystery, not whether Atlantis existed, but why we've never stopped looking for it. To understand why the Atlantis mystery has survived so long, you have to read what Plato actually wrote. Not summaries, not interpretations, the original texts. 2 dialogues, to be precise. The Timaeus and the Critias. These aren't passing references or casual mentions scattered through his work. They're deliberate, carefully constructed, methodically detailed in ways that suggest intention. In the Timaeus, Plato describes a conversation between Solon, one of Athens' founding fathers, and Egyptian priests. Solon, according to the account, traveled to Egypt and found priests who maintained temple records stretching back centuries. These records, Plato tells us, contain documentation of a war. A conflict between Atlantis and ancient Athens that supposedly occurred 9,000 years before his own time. 9,000 years. That's an enormous temporal distance, even to an ancient audience. It positions Atlantis not as recent history, but as something almost unimaginably ancient. Then the Critias goes further, much further. Plato provides granular architectural detail. He describes Atlantis with concentric rings of land and water, each perfectly proportioned. He outlines the governmental structure. He discusses the island's relationship with Neptune the sea god, and how this divine connection initially blessed the civilization with wisdom and restraint. But then, crucially, he describes moral decline, corruption spreading through the society, virtue eroding, the civilization becoming arrogant, greedy, and ultimately doomed by its own moral collapse. What's striking is Plato's method of presentation. He frames everything through a chain of reliable witnesses. This genealogy of transmission is deliberate. Solon heard it from Egyptian priests. Solon told it to Critias, his grandson. Critias passed it down through the family. And now Plato is writing it. Each link in the chain is real. Each person existed. The structure feels documentary, almost forensic in its attention to source credibility. Even more intriguing is Plato's specificity about location and timing. He places Atlantis beyond the Straits of Hercules, beyond Gibraltar, in other words. He dates it precisely, 9,000 years prior. He includes geographic coordinates, almost. These aren't the hallmarks of pure fantasy. These are the marks of someone claiming to document something real. If Plato were simply inventing a story for entertainment, why include such verifiable details? Why ground it so carefully in places and timeframes that could theoretically be checked? Yet here's where it becomes complicated. Modern scholars have noted something troubling. Plato's description of Atlantis bears striking similarities to political theories he developed elsewhere in his Republican laws. The ideal society Atlantis matches his philosophical ideals with remarkable precision. Was Atlantis, then, a philosophical thought experiment? A carefully constructed ideal society designed to illustrate his political theories rather than document actual history? The tension remains unresolved. Either Plato drew from genuine historical catastrophes, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, civilizations destroyed and forgotten, and wove them into his narrative, or he constructed an elaborate philosophical fiction so detailed, so grounded, that it convinced civilizations to come. The question is which. Before we dismiss Plato's claims as pure invention, we need to understand something crucial about the ancient world. It wasn't the primitive, geographically naive place we often imagine. The ancient world was sophisticated, connected, far more aware of distant lands than modern historians assumed for a long time. Consider the evidence. Egypt maintained detailed records of expeditions to places modern scholars initially thought unknowable to them. Hieroglyphic texts describe journeys to lands we can identify today, specific coastlines, specific regions, documented with precision. The Phoenicians weren't just trading in the Mediterranean. They were master navigators who ventured far beyond. They explored territories other civilizations barely knew existed. The Minoan civilization on Crete maintained contact with distant regions. Trade routes connected Egypt, Phoenicia, Greece, and territories we're still mapping today. These weren't isolated pockets of civilization. They were part of a vast, interconnected ancient world, with sophisticated knowledge of geography. Fragments of ancient maps still exist. When you examine them, the sophistication is startling. The coastlines are rendered with remarkable accuracy. Islands are positioned correctly. Trade routes are marked. These maps reveal that the ancient world possessed a working understanding of geography that extended far beyond their immediate neighbors. The question this raises is straightforward. If advanced civilizations existed throughout the Mediterranean, if they maintained trade networks and navigation knowledge, then why is it unreasonable to believe other advanced civilizations might have existed in regions we haven't adequately studied? When Plato references lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond Gibraltar, he wasn't making something up from nothing. He was acknowledging a geographical reality. The ancient world was vast. Continents remained unknown, islands undiscovered. Vast territories existed beyond the reach of Mediterranean civilizations, unmapped and unexplored. In that context, Plato's reference to distant lands makes sense. It's consistent with what the ancients actually knew about their world. But here's where it becomes uncertain. Plato didn't just reference unexplored lands. He claimed Egyptian priests possessed specific knowledge about those lands. Detailed records about a civilization that existed beyond known geography. Did those records truly exist? Or is this the stroke of genius, embedding false credentials into the narrative so expertly that it becomes impossible to verify? We'll never fully know. The Library of Alexandria burned. Countless documents vanished. Records detailing ancient expeditions, knowledge of distant lands, perhaps even information about Atlantis itself, all incinerated in a single catastrophe. The ancient world's hidden geography remains genuinely hidden. Not through conspiracy, but through the simple tragedy of lost time. But mythology and geology are theories. What about actual physical evidence? What about the structures that remain, standing in defiance of the timelines we've accepted? In Turkey, there's a place called Göbekli Tepe. When archaeologists first examined it, they struggled to understand what they were looking at. The site contains precisely carved stone pillars, Complex geometric designs. Organizational sophistication that suggests centralized planning. Coordinated labor. Advanced knowledge of construction. The monuments are remarkable. The problem is the date. Göbekli Tepe is approximately 9,500 years before Christ. That's more than 11,000 years old. According to conventional archaeology, civilization hadn't begun yet. Humans were still hunter-gatherers, wandering nomadic territories, incapable of organizing complex construction projects. Yet someone built Göbekli Tepe anyway. The Sphinx presents a different puzzle. Geologists have studied the erosion patterns on its surface for decades. Water erosion. The kind that takes thousands of years to develop. The kind that doesn't match the timeline when the Sphinx was supposedly built. If you accept conventional dating, the Sphinx shouldn't show this level of water damage. But it does. Some geologists suggest it's thousands of years older than Egyptology officially claims. Others insist the timeline is correct, and the erosion patterns mean something else. The disagreement itself is revealing. Then there's what lies beneath the water. The Bimini Road in the Bahamas sits on the seafloor, a series of stone formations arranged in geometric patterns. Are they natural formations or constructed pathways? Geologists debate endlessly, but the existence of such structures raises unavoidable questions. If geometric stone arrangements exist on the Caribbean seafloor, what else might be down there? What structures have we never seen because we haven't looked? The Mediterranean seafloor was largely unmapped until recently. We know it better now. And what we've discovered is that entire coastlines exist underwater. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, these regions would have been habitable. Civilizations could have thrived there. Then sea levels rose. Hundreds of feet of water-covered lands that were once dry. Entire civilizations, if they existed, would have vanished beneath the ocean. Submerged. Hidden not by conspiracy, but by geography. Here's what matters. We've explored roughly 5% of the ocean floor. 5%. We know more about the surface of the moon than about our own planet's depths. Lost civilizations aren't hidden by deliberate suppression. They're hidden by simple geography. They're waiting, literally underwater, waiting for technology sophisticated enough to find them. Something unusual happens when you begin searching through the mythology of distant cultures. When you read the flood narratives, preserved by peoples, separated by oceans, by mountains, by thousands of years of isolation, you start noticing that they're telling the same story, not variations of a story. The same story. The biblical account of Noah's flood exists almost identically in Mesopotamian texts. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written centuries before the Hebrew Bible, describes a catastrophic deluge, a chosen man, a boat, the preservation of life. Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas maintained flood myths. Their stories describe water rising, civilizations destroyed, survival through extraordinary intervention. Aboriginal Australians spoke of the dreaming, their spiritual framework that includes narratives of water-related catastrophes reshaping the world. Polynesian cultures passed down flood narratives through oral traditions so consistently that anthropologists documented nearly identical tellings across different island groups. Mesoamerican peoples carved water-related destruction into their codices, creating permanent records of catastrophic events. The skeptical response is straightforward. Humans everywhere fear water. Flooding is a natural disaster that strikes civilizations regardless of geography. Of course, flood narratives emerge independently across cultures. This is psychological necessity meeting natural occurrence. It's reasonable, logical, but it's incomplete. Because these flood myths aren't just describing water. They're describing something far more specific. They describe advanced civilizations, technologically sophisticated societies, proud peoples who built great things, and then moral corruption enters, arrogance, greed, a spiritual bankruptcy despite material advancement. Then comes judgment, punishment delivered through water, entire civilizations erased. The narrative pattern repeats across cultures with unsettling consistency. Civilization reaches heights. Civilization falls into moral compromise. Water destroys everything. This isn't accidental similarity. This is thematic coherence. Some researchers, like Graham Hancock, have proposed something radical. What if these myths aren't recording separate, independent flooding events? What if they're preserving genetic memory of a single catastrophic event that shaped human history? Specifically, the Younger Dryas period. Approximately 12,800 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Climate changed rapidly. Ice Age glaciers began melting at unprecedented rates. Sea levels rose in ways that were catastrophic for anyone living on coastlines. Hundreds of feet of water covering lands that had been inhabited for thousands of years. Entire civilizations vanished beneath the ocean. If advanced societies existed in coastal regions during this period, and there's increasing evidence they did, they would have been obliterated. Survivors migrating inland, establishing new civilizations, would carry traumatic memory of what they'd witnessed. Memory encoded into foundational myths. Spiritual frameworks. Warnings passed down through generations. The psychological trauma of seeing your world literally drowned would create narratives powerful enough to survive thousands of years. The timeline alignment is striking. Plato described Atlantis as destroyed 9,000 years before his time. That would place it around the Younger Dryas period. The global flood myths would represent preserved memory of real catastrophe, affecting multiple populations simultaneously, not separate coincidences. One genuine disaster encoded into mythological form across cultures. Whether this explanation is correct remains debated. But the pattern itself demands explanation. Nearly every ancient civilization on Earth told nearly identical stories about catastrophic water destroying advanced peoples. That consistency isn't random. It isn't coincidence. It's evidence. But mythology and geology are theories. What about actual physical evidence? What about the structures that remain, standing in defiance of the timelines we've accepted? In Turkey, there's a place called Göbekli Tepe. When archaeologists first examined it, they struggled to understand what they were looking at. The site contains precisely carved stone pillars, complex geometric designs, organizational sophistication that suggests centralized planning, coordinated labor, advanced knowledge of construction. The monuments are remarkable. The problem is the date. Göbekli Tepe is approximately 9,500 years before Christ. That's more than 11,000 years old. According to conventional archaeology, civilization hadn't begun yet. Humans were still hunter-gatherers, wandering nomadic territories, incapable of organizing complex construction projects. Yet someone built Göbekli Tepe anyway. The Sphinx presents a different puzzle. Geologists have studied the erosion patterns on its surface for decades. Water erosion. The kind that takes thousands of years to develop. The kind that doesn't match the timeline when the Sphinx was supposedly built. If you accept conventional dating, the Sphinx shouldn't show this level of water damage. But it does. Some geologists suggest it's thousands of years older than Egyptology officially claims. Others insist the timeline is correct, and the erosion patterns mean something else. The disagreement itself is revealing. Then there's what lies beneath the water. The Bimini Road in the Bahamas sits on the seafloor, a series of stone formations arranged in geometric patterns. Are they natural formations or constructed pathways? Geologists debate endlessly, but the existence of such structures raises unavoidable questions. If geometric stone arrangements exist on the Caribbean seafloor, what else might be down there? What structures have we never seen because we haven't looked? The Mediterranean seafloor was largely unmapped until recently. We know it better now. And what we've discovered is that entire coastlines exist underwater. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, these regions would have been habitable. Civilizations could have thrived there. Then sea levels rose. Hundreds of feet of water covered lands that were once dry. Entire civilizations, if they existed, would have vanished beneath the ocean. Submerged. Hidden not by conspiracy, but by geography. Here's what matters. We've explored roughly 5% of the ocean floor. 5%. We know more about the surface of the moon than about our own planet's depths. Lost civilizations aren't hidden by deliberate suppression. They're hidden by simple geography. They're waiting, literally underwater, waiting for technology sophisticated enough to find them. There's a moment that arrives during any investigation like this. A moment when you realize the evidence doesn't quite align with the official story. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just misaligned. And that misalignment itself becomes revealing. Official archaeology presents a clear timeline. Advanced civilizations emerged around 3000 BC. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley. Before that, humans were primitive, tribal, incapable of monumental construction or sophisticated organization. The timeline is presented with such confidence that it feels settled. Historical fact rather than interpretation. Yet Göbekli Tepe exists. 11,000 years old, monumentally constructed, which means something is wrong with the timeline or something is wrong with our understanding of human capability. When authorities are questioned about this discrepancy, the response is consistent. They invoke what might be called natural selection in archaeology. The idea that we study what's accessible, what's preserved, what hasn't been destroyed or lost. Absence of evidence reflects our limitations as investigators, not reality. This is actually reasonable, logical. Archaeological record is incomplete. We understand this. But reasonable explanations become suspicious when they're applied selectively. When conventional evidence emerges supporting established narratives, it's celebrated, published, peer-reviewed, integrated into textbooks. But when evidence suggests earlier advanced civilizations, something shifts. Researchers publishing findings about anomalous structures face skepticism that seems disproportionate. Professional pushback. Colleagues avoid collaboration on controversial theories, not because the evidence is weak, but because the risk is high. Associating with unconventional ideas carries professional cost. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Researchers, understanding the risks, avoid publishing unconventional findings. These findings become rarer in academic literature. The rarity becomes evidence that unconventional theories lack merit. It's circular reasoning. But it's circular reasoning disguised as scientific rigor. It feels objective because it's systematic. But the system itself is protecting certain narratives. Discoveries simply vanish from academic discourse. Archaeological sites are looted, destroyed by development, or abandoned after preliminary investigation. Sometimes this is accidental. Sometimes it seems strategic. Researchers in privately funded expeditions report that significant findings never enter peer review. They never appear in journals. They never become part of official knowledge. A literature gap opens. Discoveries occur, but don't enter the system. Whether this reflects deliberate suppression or merely pragmatic limitations of publishing, funding, and institutional incentives isn't always clear. But the pattern itself is undeniable. Controversial discoveries face extra scrutiny. Non-institutional findings lack validation pathways. Evidence for ancient sophistication gets relegated to pseudo-archaeology pushed outside legitimate discourse by institutional consensus, rather than by definitive evidence against it. Here's what this means. Mainstream narratives are protected through gatekeeping, not through disproof, not through evidence demonstrating alternatives are wrong, through control over what counts as legitimate discourse, through institutional incentive structures that reward consistency and punish revision, through professional mechanisms that make unconventional research risky. Institutions don't necessarily conspire to suppress evidence. They don't need to. The structure itself, the incentives, the gatekeeping, the peer review processes, accomplishes the suppression automatically. It's elegant, efficient, and almost impossible to detect from inside the system. Because everyone within it believes they're simply maintaining rigorous standards. Restrictions exist everywhere. You understand this. Archaeological sites require protection. Fragile structures can't withstand constant foot traffic from tourists. Excavations need security against looters. Conservation requires controlled access. These are legitimate concerns, reasonable safeguards. But something interesting happens when you start mapping which sites are restricted and which remain accessible. When you notice which restrictions seem proportional to actual risk and which seem excessive. Turkey's Lake Derinkuyu contains submerged archaeological features, known features, historically significant. Yet the site remains largely unstudied. Foreign researchers report resistance when attempting independent investigation. The explanations vary. Access is difficult. The lake is protected. The archaeology might be disrupted. But the lake is also a known location. Technology for underwater exploration exists. If the site were genuinely significant and unrestricted, wouldn't systematic investigation have occurred? the Mediterranean presents a larger puzzle. Ancient coastlines, where settlements would logically have existed, remain largely unexplored. You'd think archaeologists would be conducting systematic surveys along every ancient shoreline, yet those surveys are surprisingly limited, particularly in international waters, where jurisdictional complications create convenient barriers to investigation. The Mediterranean's deepest trenches and canyons have barely been explored, not because exploration is impossible, because exploration apparently hasn't been prioritized. The Caribbean mirrors this pattern. Certain underwater regions containing unusual structures remain off-limits to independent researchers. Official explanations exist. They shift when pressed. The Bimini Road sits in this restricted space. It's difficult to verify independently, difficult to investigate thoroughly. The restriction itself creates the controversy by preventing definitive resolution. Private expeditions funded by wealthy individuals discover significant sites regularly. Yet these discoveries never enter conventional publication. Peer review doesn't happen. Academic scrutiny remains absent. The findings exist in private documentation, known to insiders, invisible to mainstream knowledge. This isn't necessarily conspiracy. It's simply wealth-meeting archaeology. But it creates knowledge gaps, discoveries known to some while remaining hidden from others. Egypt's Valley of the Kings exemplifies the pattern most clearly. Chambers exist within that valley, chambers that have never been opened, never been formally surveyed. Ground-penetrating radar between 2015 and 2016 suggested previously unknown chambers behind Tutankhamun's tomb. The scientific response should have been immediate excitement, comprehensive investigation. But instead, formal excavation was delayed, then delayed again. Official explanations cite conservation concerns, international politics, diplomatic sensitivity. But consider the logic. If those chambers contained nothing anomalous, opening them would simply confirm existing understanding, validate existing chronologies, strengthen official narratives. Why would conservation concerns prevent investigation? Why would politics delay scientific inquiry into your own historical record? Unless the chambers might contain something institutionally inconvenient, evidence of earlier civilizations, earlier Egyptian dynasties not in official records, technological artifacts inconsistent with conventional chronology, then the delay becomes strategically valuable. By declining to investigate, the institution avoids pressure to revise established histories. It's not active suppression, it's passive avoidance, the path of least institutional resistance. This pattern repeats across continents. Potential discoveries remain unexplored, significant sites remain unstudied, important findings remain unreported, not necessarily through malice. Through institutional convenience, through the simple human tendency to avoid investigation that might create uncomfortable pressure for change. The question becomes unavoidable. What specifically are these restrictions protecting? What would be discovered if investigations actually occurred? At this point, a question crystallizes. It's unavoidable now. What would it actually take? What would constitute sufficient evidence for mainstream archaeology to revise its fundamental chronologies? To accept that advanced civilizations existed before the officially accepted timelines? The theoretical answer is simple. Irrefutable physical evidence, sophisticated artifacts, structures of undeniable age, written records predating conventional civilization. Something so definitively anomalous that denial becomes impossible. This is what should matter. What evidence demands. The practical answer is far more complicated. Any such discovery would require extraordinary institutional will. The kind of will that professional incentives actively discourage. Consider a researcher's position. Confirm existing narratives quietly, and your career advances steadily. Question fundamental chronologies, and you face professional risks that far exceed potential rewards. This isn't cynicism, it's institutional reality. Academic credibility takes decades to build. It takes moments to destroy through association with controversial theories. Most researchers understand this calculus. Most choose the safe path. This creates a profound asymmetry. Evidence supporting conventional narratives flows freely through academic channels. Journals accept it, universities publish it, colleagues collaborate on it. But evidence challenging those narratives concentrates elsewhere. Alternative media, private research, fringe publications, institutional exile. The evidence itself might be equally rigorous, equally valid, but its visibility differs dramatically. Its legitimacy within establishment discourse is compromised not by quality, but by institutional gatekeeping. This asymmetry perpetuates itself without conscious conspiracy. No one needs to decide to suppress alternative evidence. The structure itself accomplishes suppression automatically. Professional incentives protect establishment narratives. Career advancement depends on consistency. Institutional credibility requires maintaining established positions. The system protects itself not through malice, but through structural logic. So the question becomes not whether evidence exists. The question becomes whether institutions have fundamentally structured themselves to remain incapable of accepting such evidence even if confronted with it. Whether the system itself has become hermetically sealed against contradiction. If that's true, if institutions are structurally incapable of genuine revision, then genuine investigation must occur elsewhere. Outside institutional channels, in spaces where incentives don't discourage challenging the status quo, which means looking where institutions haven't looked, or where they've deliberately avoided looking. Imagine Earth differently than you know it today, not dramatically different, just shifted, reshaped by time and water and ice. This is where understanding Atlantis begins. Not with mythology or philosophy, but with geography, with understanding what our planet actually looked like during the periods when human civilization was supposedly just beginning. The conventional timeline places advanced civilization's emergence around 3000 BC. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley. But this timeline makes an assumption. It assumes humans only recently became sophisticated enough to build complex societies. Yet Göbekli Tepe challenges this assumption. If sophisticated construction existed 11,000 years ago, what else existed that we haven't discovered? The timeline isn't settled fact. It's a framework increasingly strained by evidence. To understand what we might be missing, you need to visualize the Ice Age world. Sea levels during that period were hundreds of feet lower than today, not slightly lower, dramatically lower. Coastlines extended far beyond their modern positions. Vast continental shelves that now slope beneath the ocean were once dry land. Rivers carved valleys through terrain now submerged. Ecosystems thrived on ground now covered by hundreds of feet of water. The Mediterranean's coastline was different. The Atlantic's continental shelf was different. Every major ocean region where water now dominates was once habitable terrain. If advanced civilizations existed, they would have clustered where civilizations always cluster. On coastlines. Water access means trade routes, agricultural abundance, fishing, transportation. Every sophisticated ancient civilization you know about Egypt, Phoenicia, Greece, Rome, all thrived on water access. This isn't coincidence. It's fundamental to how human civilization develops. Trade drives advancement. Water enables trade. But most Ice Age coastlines are now underwater. Around 12,800 to 11,500 years ago, something dramatic happened. The Younger Dryas period. Ice sheets melted at unprecedented rates. Sea levels rose catastrophically. In some regions, the rise exceeded hundreds of feet per century. Imagine living on a coastline and watching the ocean slowly consume your territory, year after year, generation after generation. Settlements built on ancient beaches gradually disappearing beneath waves. Civilizations that thrived for millennia suddenly becoming uninhabitable. Survivors forced inland. The only people who escaped were those who migrated away from the drowning coastlines. They carried memories, traumatic memories of their world, literally being swallowed by water. These memories would transform into myth, into warning narratives passed down through generations, into universal flood mythology. The overwhelming evidence of early advanced civilization would be underwater, visible only through underwater archaeology or sonar survey. Yet underwater archaeology remains underfunded and geographically limited. We've explored more of the lunar surface than the ocean floor. Most oceanic regions remain barely surveyed. The Mediterranean, despite being relatively explored, contains vast unmapped sections. The Atlantic's deeper trenches and canyons remain largely unknown. The Pacific is almost entirely unmapped in detail. This creates the perfect scenario. Overwhelming evidence of ancient civilization exists. But it exists in places we've barely looked. Places that require technology and funding and institutional will to investigate. Places that remain largely invisible to conventional archaeology. The question isn't whether advanced ancient peoples existed. The question is whether we've actually looked in the right places with sufficient commitment to find them. The Mediterranean is where Plato said to look. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, he claimed. Beyond Gibraltar. And when you examine the Mediterranean carefully, understanding its geological history and its civilizations, something becomes visible. Not definitive proof, but plausibility. Candidates. Locations where advanced ancient civilizations thrived and were subsequently destroyed or submerged. The Minoan civilization is the most obvious candidate. Crete. From approximately 3000 BC to 1100 BC, the Minoans developed one of the Bronze Age's most sophisticated societies. Their cities featured plumbing systems that rival modern infrastructure. Multi-story buildings. Artistic sophistication that astonishes contemporary observers. Far-reaching trade networks connecting them to distant regions. They possessed everything Plato attributed to Atlantis: technological advancement, organizational complexity, cultural sophistication, military capability. They were, by any measure, an advanced civilization. Then something catastrophic happened. Around 1600 BC, Santorini erupted. Not gradually. Explosively. The eruption was so powerful, it essentially destroyed the island, leaving only a massive crater, a caldera filled with water. The explosion generated a tsunami that swept across the Mediterranean. Coastal settlements, hundreds of miles away, were devastated. The ash fall was so substantial, it darkened skies across the region. To survivors witnessing this, it would have seemed apocalyptic. Civilization destroying. Sudden. Inexplicable except through supernatural intervention. Divine punishment. The wrath of gods. Minoan civilization never fully recovered from this catastrophe. Consider the implications. A sophisticated civilization experienced sudden, catastrophic destruction through water and fire and darkness. Survivors preserved memory of this event. They told their children. Their children told theirs. The story transformed through retellings, becoming mythologized, elevated to supernatural status. Egyptian priests, aware of Mediterranean trade and the catastrophic eruption visible from Egypt, incorporated these stories into their own records. Generations later, Plato accessed these Egyptian records and wrote about Atlantis. The timeline fits. The catastrophic nature matches. The sophistication matches. The Minoan civilization could reasonably be the historical kernel from which the Atlantis legend grew. But there are other candidates. Coastal regions of North Africa, near Santorini. The submerged continental shelf in these areas contains geological evidence of prior habitation. Ancient myths referring to lands beyond the Mediterranean might reference these now underwater terrains. Settlements that thrived when sea levels were lower and vanished as waters rose. The Strait of Gibraltar itself is significant. It marks a geological transition between Mediterranean and Atlantic. The Atlantic continental shelf adjacent to Gibraltar contains evidence of rivers and valleys. Terrain that was habitable during periods of lower sea level. Settlements could have thrived there. Trade routes could have connected these regions. Then sea levels rose. Lands vanished beneath the ocean. The catastrophe would have been visible to Mediterranean civilizations. News of sunken lands would have traveled. Stories would have spread. The evidence doesn't prove Atlantis was Minoan civilization specifically. It doesn't prove that submerged coasts were Plato's lost continent. But it establishes something crucial. Mediterranean regions are geologically and archaeologically plausible locations where advanced ancient civilizations could have existed and subsequently been destroyed or submerged. The pieces fit together. The story becomes not just myth, but possible history, which means we should be looking harder, But the Mediterranean is only one body of water, only one place where submerged civilizations might exist. As you expand your geographical vision, evidence accumulates across continents. In the Caribbean, underwater archaeology has revealed structures and artifacts suggesting sophisticated maritime culture. The Bimini Road exists near the Bahamas. Limestone blocks arranged in geometric patterns on the seafloor. Geologists debate endlessly about whether these are natural formations or constructed pathways. But independent researchers have documented similar geometric structures in multiple Caribbean locations. One geometric formation might be coincidence. Multiple formations with identical patterns suggest something else. Intentional construction, deliberate arrangement, design. The Puerto Rico Trench, one of the Atlantic's deepest ocean trenches, contains features indicating past habitation. Underwater caves show evidence of human presence during periods when sea levels were lower and these regions were accessible. Stone tools have been recovered from depths that should be impossible. Artifacts suggesting maritime peoples with sophisticated seafaring capability. The Atlantic continental shelf itself contains underwater features, canyons, plateaus, seamounts that would have been habitable terrain when sea levels were lower. Geological surveys indicate these regions supported ecosystems capable of sustaining human populations. If maritime civilizations thrived in Atlantic coastal regions during the Ice Age, their evidence would lie hundreds of feet underwater now, preserved by the ocean environment. But invisible without systematic underwater survey, hidden not by conspiracy, but by geography and water. Consider what this means for maritime capability. Polynesian cultures demonstrated sophisticated ocean navigation in ancient times. They traveled vast distances across the Pacific with precision. If such capability existed in the Pacific, why assume it couldn't have existed in the Atlantic? Pre-Columbian American cultures possessed maritime knowledge that challenges assumptions about ancient seafaring limitations. They understood ocean currents, navigation, shipbuilding. They traveled. They traded. They connected distant regions. The evidence, fragmentary, contested, scattered across continents, suggests something consistent. Advanced maritime civilizations might have existed in Atlantic and Caribbean regions. They thrived during periods of lower sea level. They built structures, created artifacts, developed knowledge. Then sea levels rose. Civilizations were displaced or destroyed. Their evidence sank, became buried beneath hundreds of feet of water. Now it waits, preserved by the ocean environment, invisible to conventional archaeology, accessible only to well-funded expeditions with appropriate technology, hidden in plain sight, literally beneath our feet, accessible but invisible. But what if these civilizations left something else behind, something that didn't sink beneath the waves, something deliberately preserved in stone and symbol and structure, knowledge encoded into monuments, warnings carved into landscapes, messages left for whoever might eventually search for them? There's a peculiar observation that emerges when you examine ancient structures across the world. Not one structure, not isolated examples, but patterns, repeated patterns that suggest intentionality. Knowledge, preserved deliberately across millennia. The Great Pyramid of Giza presents the most obvious example. Mathematics encoded into stone. Its dimensions don't just represent architectural choices. They encode the value of pi to multiple decimal places, knowledge that requires sophisticated mathematics. The proportions relate to Earth's circumference and polar diameter in ratios that demand geometric sophistication most ancient peoples supposedly didn't possess. Its internal passages align with stellar coordinates with precision that seems almost impossible for the era. Chambers positioned with acoustic properties suggesting advanced engineering understanding. The pyramid's orientation points to true north with remarkable accuracy. Not approximate north, true north. An achievement requiring either centuries of sophisticated observation or inherited knowledge from a culture that possessed such understanding. Then you examine Mesoamerican structures. Mayan temples encode astronomical knowledge with extraordinary precision. The builders could predict celestial events centuries in advance. Not vaguely, precisely. The mathematics required would match medieval European astronomers at minimum. Yet Mesoamerican cultures allegedly developed this sophistication independently and simultaneously with Old World civilizations. The coincidence strains plausibility. Multiple cultures discovering identical advanced mathematics without communication seems statistically unlikely. Stonehenge demonstrates similar patterns. The structure aligns with celestial events with astronomical precision. The alignments point to specific positions of celestial bodies at specific historical periods. Knowledge that would require centuries of observation to acquire. Not guesswork, not religious coincidence. Deliberate astronomical knowledge. The pattern repeats globally. Multiple ancient structures share astronomical alignment characteristics. The consistency suggests either independent discovery of identical knowledge across isolated civilizations or transmission of knowledge from a common source. When you understand basic statistics and probability, independent discovery becomes increasingly implausible. Transmission becomes more reasonable. Consider what this means. If ancient peoples weren't sophisticated enough to develop advanced mathematics and astronomy independently, but their structures clearly encode such knowledge, where did that knowledge come from? One possibility. They inherited it. Knowledge was transmitted from earlier, more advanced civilizations to successor cultures. This knowledge persisted in monuments and tradition, even as the source civilization faded into legend. This hypothesis becomes more plausible when you remember that ancient peoples possessed human intelligence identical to modern people. If knowledge existed in one location, transmission to other locations through maritime trade, migration, or explicit teaching becomes reasonable. Not fantastical. Simply practical application of how knowledge spreads. Ancient civilizations, with sophisticated astronomical and mathematical understanding, might have deliberately encoded that knowledge into monuments. Not for decoration, for preservation, for communication across generations, for ensuring that if knowledge was lost, the monuments would remain, waiting, speaking silently across millennia, whispering to anyone sophisticated enough to decode them. The question becomes not whether ancient peoples possessed such knowledge, but where they obtained it. And that question opens possibilities that conventional history has avoided asking. But this raises a fundamental question. How did ancient peoples possess such sophisticated knowledge? Where did it originate? Archaeological evidence and mythological patterns suggest something that conventional history rarely acknowledges: knowledge transfer. Not independent discovery. Not coincidental development. Deliberate transmission across civilizations and generations. The Sumerian civilization emerges around 3500 BC with something remarkable: sophisticated astronomy, advanced mathematics, complex writing systems. These don't appear gradually in the archaeological record. They appear fully formed, complete. Modern scholars initially suspected this knowledge derived from later cultures, retroactively attributed to Sumerians. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Sumerians possessed this knowledge. But how? Without documented developmental period, without visible precursors, the knowledge simply existed. One possibility demands consideration. What if Sumerians didn't develop this knowledge independently? What if they inherited it? Knowledge transmitted from an earlier civilization that didn't leave archaeological evidence in conventional locations. A civilization that thrived in coastal regions now submerged beneath the ocean. Their settlements underwater, their cities inaccessible, but their knowledge persisting. Knowledge transmitted orally survives. Knowledge written on perishable materials persists in memory. Knowledge encoded in monuments remains forever. When survivors of a destroyed coastal civilization migrated inland, they carried this knowledge. They possessed astronomical understanding, mathematical sophistication, organizational knowledge. To indigenous inland peoples encountering these survivors, the knowledge would have seemed miraculous, supernatural. They would have elevated these survivors to divine status, treated their knowledge as divine teaching. The Sumerian flood myth captures exactly this. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes civilization emerging suddenly following catastrophic flood. In mythological language, this might reflect historical reality. Survivors from a destroyed coastal civilization arriving inland with preserved knowledge, establishing new societies, transmitting what they'd preserved. Over generations, This knowledge would be reintegrated into new cultural contexts, becoming the foundation of documented civilizations. Similar patterns emerge across cultures. Egyptian astronomical knowledge appears in the historical record with remarkable sophistication, no gradual development visible, simply existing. Mesoamerican mathematics exhibits identical characteristics. Chinese engineering sophistication emerges complete and sophisticated. The pattern repeats. Rather than requiring multiple independent discoveries of identical sophisticated systems, consider an alternative. One origin point. Knowledge transmission across cultures. Through migration, through trade, through intentional teaching. This explanation is more parsimonious, more elegant. It accounts for why ancient cultures possessed knowledge disproportionately advanced for their era. They weren't developing from scratch, they were inheriting. They were applying knowledge from predecessors. Every great ancient civilization claims their knowledge came from the gods, from divine teaching, from supernatural intervention. What if they were describing literal truth, just filtered through mythological language? What if survivors of an advanced civilization, arriving with sophisticated knowledge, were treated as divine beings? What if their knowledge was treated as sacred, because the survivors themselves were treated as sacred? This transforms the lost civilization question. It wasn't lost in the sense of disappearing entirely. It persisted, in the monuments that encoded its knowledge, in the myths that preserved its memory, in the civilizations that inherited its wisdom. Aspects of that civilization survived, transformed, transmitted forward. The question becomes, if knowledge was being deliberately preserved and transmitted, what made preservation so crucial? What catastrophe threatened civilization so severely that survivors needed to encode wisdom as insurance against forgetting? Now consider the physical. Not mythology, not encoded knowledge. Pure engineering, the structures that still stand, demanding explanation. The Great Pyramid of Giza contains approximately 2.3 million limestone blocks. Some weigh as much as 15 tons. These blocks are fitted together with such precision that modern engineers cannot insert a knife blade between them. Not millimeters of gap, nothing. The fit is perfect. The structure was completed in an estimated 20-year construction period, which means the blocks were being moved and positioned at a rate demanding extraordinary logistical sophistication. Not casual construction. Industrial-scale operation. The internal structure reveals more complexity. Passages aligned with stellar coordinates. Chambers positioned with acoustic properties that would be difficult to achieve by accident. Structural redundancies suggesting engineering foresight about stress distribution and load bearing. The builders understood physics. They understood mathematics. They understood how to construct enduring systems. But how? The conventional explanation invokes ramps, levers, and human muscle. Mathematically possible, yes, but consider what it actually requires. A workforce so enormous that organizing it would rival modern military operations. Supply lines complex enough to feed thousands of workers continuously. Agricultural output exceeding what Egypt's documented capacity could support. The logistical challenges strain credibility even before addressing the precision requirements. Other sites present similar puzzles. Pumapunku in Bolivia features stone blocks cut and fitted with such precision that the structures remain earthquake-resistant despite lacking mortar. The stones display evidence of tool marks from metal implements, more sophisticated than bronze tools known to Andean cultures. Some surfaces suggest advanced cutting techniques, perhaps stone heated to specific temperatures, causing controlled fracturing, perhaps something else entirely. The tools leave their fingerprints in the stone, and those fingerprints don't match documented ancient technology. Baalbek in Lebanon contains foundation stones so massive that conventional quarrying and transportation methods seem inadequate. Some weigh 800 tons. They're cut with laser precision angles. How ancient peoples moved and positioned such masses remains genuinely unclear. Engineers study the site and leave puzzled. The conventional response involves invoking ingenuity. Ancient peoples were clever. They figured out solutions. We simply haven't reconstructed exactly how. This response is reasonable, until you notice the pattern. The same engineering sophistication appears at multiple sites across continents. Similar precision, similar scale, similar apparent impossibility, identical problems solved identically. This repetition suggests something crucial. Either ancient peoples across isolated civilizations independently developed identical engineering solutions, universal ingenuity producing identical results without communication, or something else occurred. Knowledge transmission. Construction techniques passed from advanced civilizations to successors. Structural principles understood and applied. Tools and methods inherited and gradually lost as the source civilization faded from memory. This explanation accounts for why so many ancient structures demonstrate sophistication we can barely explain. The builders possessed inherited knowledge about construction methods. They applied it. Then, over generations, that knowledge degraded as connections to the source civilization were severed. The question becomes not whether ancient peoples were clever. Clearly, they were. The question becomes whether their cleverness represented original invention or inherited application of knowledge from somewhere else entirely. But engineering and monuments tell only part of the story. There are objects, physical artifacts scattered through museums and private collections worldwide. Objects that museums don't quite know what to do with. Objects that don't fit the timelines we've constructed. Objects that suggest something profoundly different about ancient technological capability. The Baghdad Battery exists in a museum in Iraq. Clay jars discovered near Baghdad, dated to approximately 250 BC. Inside these jars are copper and zinc elements arranged in specific configurations. When filled with acidic liquid, these elements generate electrical current, not accidentally, by design. Were these decorative objects or functional batteries? If functional, they suggest knowledge of electrochemistry existing in ancient Iraq. Knowledge that shouldn't exist according to conventional timelines. The Antikythera mechanism comes from a shipwreck near ancient Greece, a bronze device containing at least 30 interlocking gears. The device calculates astronomical positions. It predicts eclipse timing. Its sophistication rivals 18th century mechanical clocks. The problem is the date. It predates any known technology of equivalent sophistication by over 1,000 years. How did such mechanical sophistication emerge without visible predecessors? How did gearing technology that complex arise in isolation? Costa Rica contains hundreds of perfectly spherical stones. Some weigh 16 tons. These stones are geometrically perfect. How were perfect spheres created without modern machinery? The precision suggests intentional creation, not natural formation. Yet the method remains unexplained. Inca stonework in Peru displays precision that defies casual explanation. Stones fitted so precisely they require no mortar. Joints so tight they've remained stable for centuries without weathering. Modern engineers studying the construction express puzzlement. Some scholars propose experimentation and refinement. But this sophistication appears simultaneously at multiple sites without documented developmental period. No primitive attempts visible, no gradual refinement. Simply perfection appearing fully formed. Crystal skulls present perhaps the most contested anomalies. The Mitchell-Hedges skull and others display optical properties suggesting advanced knowledge of crystal properties and cutting techniques. Conventional explanations attribute them to 19th century hoaxing. But technical analysis of some specimens suggests cutting techniques that wouldn't be available until modern times. The precision cuts, the optical properties, the intentional design. They don't match 19th century technology either. The pattern across all these artifacts is unmistakable. Technical sophistication seemingly exceeding available knowledge, appearing without documented development or known predecessors, suggesting transmission from more advanced sources. These aren't isolated oddities, they're consistent anomalies. The conventional response dismisses them as misidentifications, hoaxes, coincidences, or creations of lost civilizations we've underestimated. All explanations remain possible. But consider the cumulative weight. Engineering paradoxes worldwide. Astronomical knowledge encoded into structures across continents. Universal flood mythology with consistent themes. And now, anomalous artifacts demonstrating technological sophistication that shouldn't exist. The picture emerging is of an ancient world far more technologically sophisticated than standard timelines admit. Not uniformly advanced everywhere, but pockets of sophistication, Transmission of knowledge. Technology that appears suddenly, persists for periods, then vanishes as civilizations collapse or knowledge is lost. The question becomes unavoidable. What if ancient civilizations possess technology that modernity has forgotten? What if that technology is partly responsible for the sophistication we observe in ancient structures and achievements? What happened to that technology? Where did it go? Imagine a catastrophe. A coastal civilization thriving with sophisticated technology, advanced tools, specialized knowledge, centralized craft centers where technologies are developed and maintained. Then, disaster strikes. Flooding, volcanic eruption, earthquake. The civilization is destroyed. Most people die. Survivors flee inland, carrying what they can, what they remember. But they don't carry the technologies themselves. The specialized tools remain in destroyed cities. The craft centers are gone. The knowledge repositories, if they existed, are inaccessible. The survivors possess memory of extraordinary capability, but not understanding of how it worked, not access to the materials and tools required to replicate it. Over generations, this memory transforms. It becomes something else. The technologies become magic. The advanced civilization becomes gods. The knowledge becomes divine teaching. Within a few generations, survivors no longer understand the technological basis. They remember that their ancestors possessed extraordinary capabilities, but the mechanisms remain mysterious. Over centuries, descendants of survivors develop new technologies independently. They innovate, they experiment, they discover principles through trial and error, they achieve sophistication. But they're starting from scratch. They lack inherited knowledge. Their achievements, while genuine, are limited by the absence of prior knowledge to build upon. This cycle could repeat multiple times across human history. Each catastrophic event destroying advanced civilization would reset technological development for surviving populations. Each cycle would achieve sophistication through innovation, but knowledge would be lost in transition. Over vast timescales, this creates a pattern: episodic advancement and collapse. Each cycle achieving sophistication, never retaining knowledge across collapses. The evidence of lost technology would appear in specific places, encoded in ancient myths and monuments, in anomalous artifacts that don't fit timelines, in structures we can't explain, in knowledge we can't account for. Some ancient temples might actually be technological installations, power generation systems, communication devices, astronomical observation equipment, whose function has been forgotten, whose purpose remains mysterious. Consider what this explains. Why ancient peoples possessed anomalous knowledge, why they built seemingly impossible structures, why they encoded sophisticated information into monuments, why they created myths describing gods and divine teaching, why they preserved warnings about catastrophe and cycles. They were building on inherited knowledge from lost civilizations, applying techniques partially remembered and partially rediscovered, working with fragments of understanding passed down through generations, creating monuments to preserve what might otherwise be forgotten. The technology hypothesis, combined with geological evidence of environmental catastrophe, offers comprehensive explanation for the evidence we've examined. Not conspiracy, not fantasy. Simply the recurring pattern of civilization, advancement, catastrophe, and loss repeated across human history. The question becomes whether we're willing to recognize this pattern, and what that recognition requires us to do. Academic institutions are fundamentally conservative structures. This isn't a character flaw, it's a structural feature built into the architecture of how knowledge systems operate. Institutions exist partially to preserve established knowledge, and that preservation serves important functions. It prevents intellectual chaos. It protects valid findings from constant, exhausting questioning. It maintains coherent bodies of knowledge that researchers can build upon without reinventing foundational concepts every generation. But preservation, by its nature, creates resistance to revision. What protects good knowledge also protects flawed knowledge. The same mechanisms that prevent valuable findings from being discarded also prevent outdated conclusions from being updated. Historians and archaeologists build careers by establishing authoritative narratives. A researcher who spends 20 years documenting a historical period within existing frameworks achieves professional respect. Publications, conference invitations, tenure. That same researcher, changing conclusions based on new evidence, risks being perceived as unreliable. Colleagues might wonder if the previous work was sloppy. Institutions might question whether 2 decades of research was fundamentally wasted. The career incentive structure rewards consistency more than responsiveness to new evidence. Changing your mind, even for good reasons, carries professional costs. Additionally, institutional funding flows toward research that confirms established frameworks. Departments receive resources based partly on reputation for valid scholarship. Funding agencies direct grants toward projects promising publishable results within established contexts. A research proposal suggesting that 3,000 years of historical understanding requires complete revision faces immediate skepticism from funding committees. The institutional risk of being wrong about major revision exceeds the reward of being correct. Even if the revision proves accurate, the researcher who proposed it has spent years outside mainstream acceptance, potentially damaging their career beyond repair. This creates a profound asymmetry. Evidence supporting existing narratives flows through normal channels, receives standard peer review, gets published in established journals. Evidence challenging those narratives faces extra scrutiny, reduced funding, and institutional skepticism, regardless of technical quality. Furthermore, institutional prestige derives partly from expertise. If Egyptologists' understanding of Old Kingdom history proves fundamentally wrong, their institutional authority diminishes. Decades of confident pronouncements become embarrassing. This isn't conscious rejection of evidence, it's structural resistance built into how institutions operate. Museums, universities, and research institutions have reputational capital invested in their established positions. Admitting error requires acknowledging that prior decades of institutional confidence rested on wrong frameworks. That acknowledgement carries costs that extend beyond individual researchers to entire departments, journals, and professional organizations. This explains why unconventional findings, even when technically sound, receive institutional resistance disproportionate to the evidence. It also explains why certain researchers maintain careers in alternative archaeology, despite academic skepticism. They've accepted professional costs in exchange for intellectual freedom. They've traded institutional security for the ability to pursue questions that universities won't fund. The institutional resistance isn't organized conspiracy. It's systemic gatekeeping serving functions that institutions consider important, protecting established knowledge, maintaining professional standards, preserving departmental reputations. These goals aren't inherently malicious, but they create environments where evidence challenging established narratives faces barriers that evidence supporting those narratives doesn't encounter. Institutions don't suppress evidence through conspiracy. They suppress it through structure, by making careers dependent on consistency and advancement conditional on conformity. Questioning the gatekeeper's authority remains professionally dangerous, even in societies that pride themselves on intellectual freedom. Understanding institutional resistance explains why evidence remains marginalized, but it raises a crucial question. If institutions can't be trusted to evaluate this evidence objectively, what alternative mechanisms exist for evidence evaluation, and who is willing to invest in those alternatives? Beyond the walls of universities and museums, there exists a parallel world of exploration. Independent researchers, private explorers, and alternative scholars investigate questions that mainstream archaeology has quietly set aside. They operate without the institutional constraints that shape conventional research, which grants them remarkable freedom. The trade-off, of course, is access. They lack the vast funding networks, the laboratory infrastructure, the institutional credibility that opens doors, and they operate without the peer review systems that filter out weak work before it reaches public attention. This creates a peculiar landscape. Some alternative research is rigorous, methodologically sound, built on careful evidence collection and conservative interpretation. Some is wildly speculative, constructed on wishful thinking and confirmation bias. The community is heterogeneous, which presents an epistemological puzzle. How do you evaluate sources when they exist outside established credibility structures? Traditional academic research relies on institutional affiliation as a proxy for quality, Peer review, university positions, published journals, these mechanisms signal that work has passed through quality filters. Alternative researchers bypass these systems entirely. They fund expeditions through private wealth, through crowdfunding campaigns, through monetization of alternative media channels. This funding model allows investigations that institutional sources would never support, research questions that universities have deprioritized, sites that require permissions mainstream archaeology won't pursue, expeditions to locations that challenge established chronologies. Independent explorers have investigated underwater sites off coastlines where sea levels were lower during the last ice age. They've conducted unauthorized surveys of restricted areas. They've pursued research questions that would end academic careers if proposed within universities. And here's what makes the situation complex. Some findings from alternative research channels have eventually been validated by mainstream archaeology. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough to establish a pattern. Alternative researchers aren't uniformly unreliable. They're operating in a different institutional context, with different incentives and different constraints. The alternative research community includes engineers who apply structural analysis to ancient sites, scientists who've left institutional positions to pursue independent investigation, academics who stepped outside their universities because they grew frustrated with institutional constraints on acceptable research questions. Some have legitimate credentials, but chose independence over institutional security. Others lack traditional academic training, but have developed genuine expertise through years of dedicated investigation. They've traveled extensively, studied sites firsthand, developed specialized knowledge that comes from direct observation rather than library research. For audiences trying to navigate this landscape, the challenge is evaluation without institutional gatekeeping. If you can't trust institutions to provide unbiased assessment, and alternative sources lack established quality controls, how do you determine what's credible? The answer isn't to accept all alternative sources uncritically. That would simply replace one form of lazy thinking with another. But categorical rejection is equally unthinking. The solution is applying consistent critical thinking regardless of source, examining evidence quality, evaluating source reliability, assessing theoretical coherence, identifying potential biases. These standards apply universally, whether the source is a tenured professor or an independent explorer. Some alternative research meets rigorous standards, some doesn't. Individual evaluation matters more than institutional affiliation. What makes the alternative research community valuable isn't that all its work is correct. It's that this community pursues questions mainstream institutions have abandoned. If alternative researchers never found genuine evidence of lost civilizations, conventional archaeology would retain more credibility for dismissing the entire question. But if independent explorers are consistently finding evidence that mainstream archaeology ignores, then the existence of alternative research channels becomes crucially important for truth discovery. Outside institutions, explorers and researchers are finding evidence of lost civilizations using their own resources, operating without the constraints that prevent mainstream archaeology from looking in inconvenient places. If alternative researchers are finding evidence that mainstream archaeology ignores, what specifically are they discovering? And if evidence of lost civilizations exists, what does that imply about what we might discover if we actively searched in places institutions currently restrict or ignore? With understanding of both institutional gatekeeping and alternative research channels, the suppression question becomes more nuanced. Suppression might occur through multiple mechanisms: deliberate concealment by institutions protecting preferred narratives, restriction of access to sites, preventing independent verification, funding bias that limits research into unconventional questions, publication gatekeeping, ensuring unconventional findings don't enter mainstream discourse. Any or all of these could be operating simultaneously. Genuine conspiracy-level suppression may exist, but it remains difficult to prove. Structural suppression through institutional incentives is demonstrable and sufficient to explain many patterns without requiring intentional conspiracy. The evidence suggests suppression through structure more than conscious concealment, though both might occur in different contexts. The distinction matters less than the effect. Whether suppression happens through deliberate coordination or predictable structural behavior, The result is the same. Evidence remains marginalized. Questions go unasked. Investigations don't receive funding. But here's what makes the situation interesting. If suppression were total and effective, we wouldn't see the fragmentary evidence leaking through into documentary films, alternative media, and independent research channels. Perfect suppression wouldn't allow any information escape. The fact that evidence exists discussed in alternative media, documented in private research, visible through underground networks, suggests that suppression, while real, is incomplete. This incompleteness creates space for investigation and information flow. Maybe suppression isn't total conspiracy, but partial gatekeeping, which means evidence is already escaping the gates, scattered across alternative channels, waiting for someone to see the pattern. The question becomes practical rather than theoretical. If we operated as though suppression were real but incomplete, where would we direct investigation? What evidence is already escaping suppression that we haven't yet properly synthesized? What patterns become visible when you collect fragments from multiple alternative sources and examine them together? Across 7 chapters, we've built a case. Mythology suggests lost civilizations. Geology indicates they could exist. Engineering paradoxes suggest advanced knowledge. And institutional resistance explains why evidence remains marginalized. Now it's time to synthesize this into what the evidence actually points toward and what we should do with it. When we compile evidence from multiple disciplines, geology, archaeology, mythology, engineering analysis, and historical study, a coherent pattern emerges. This pattern isn't proof of specific historical narratives. It doesn't confirm Atlantis existed at precise coordinates or that ancient astronauts visited Earth. But it is evidence of genuine mysteries that conventional explanations inadequately address. The pattern becomes visible only when you stop examining individual pieces in isolation and start looking at how they fit together. The pattern includes universal flood mythology, suggesting shared historical catastrophe across isolated populations. It includes archaeological anomalies, indicating engineering sophistication that exceeds assumed ancient capability. Ancient texts and structures, encoding astronomical and mathematical knowledge that supposedly primitive cultures shouldn't possess. Geological evidence that coastlines were inhabited prior to sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. And institutional resistance to investigating these anomalies that seems disproportionate to their speculative nature. Individually, each piece of evidence could be dismissed. Flood myths are just stories. Engineering anomalies reflect our underestimation of ancient peoples. Advanced knowledge could have developed through trial and error over centuries. Geological evidence is circumstantial. Institutional resistance is just caution. But collectively, these pieces constitute a coherent challenge to official historical narratives. The pattern suggests that human history included advanced civilizations in regions now submerged or inaccessible. That knowledge was transmitted across cultures through migration, trade, and teaching. That catastrophic events destroyed these civilizations, while survivors preserved fragments of knowledge in mythology and monuments. The pieces were scattered across disciplines, museums, mythology, and underwater graves. But when you compile them into a single pattern, a picture emerges that changes everything about how we understand human history. This isn't claiming certainty about Atlantis' location or nature. Rather, it's establishing that lost advanced civilizations, while unconventional by mainstream standards, represent a reasonable historical hypothesis given available evidence. The hypothesis explains multiple phenomena that conventional narratives address awkwardly or dismiss entirely. The coastal civilizations hypothesis specifically explains why advanced civilization evidence is sparse on land but would be abundant underwater. It explains why we find advanced engineering without documented development periods. It explains why ancient peoples possessed anomalous knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and geography without visible learning curves. It explains the universal flood mythology across cultures that had no documented contact. It explains why institutional resistance persists despite accumulating evidence, because revising timelines threatens established expertise and departmental authority. It explains why alternative researchers continue investigating despite mainstream dismissal, because the pattern they observe isn't adequately explained by official narratives. The hypothesis isn't proven. Proving it would require extensive underwater archaeology in restricted zones, unrestricted site access where permissions are currently denied, and institutional willingness to seriously investigate unconventional evidence. None of these conditions currently exist. But the hypothesis is increasingly plausible given cumulative evidence. And this shift in plausibility carries profound implications. If lost civilizations existed and possessed knowledge that was partially recovered and transmitted through survivor populations, what follows? How does this change our understanding of human history? What does it suggest about ancient peoples' capabilities that we've systematically underestimated? What remains to be discovered in regions we haven't properly searched because institutions deemed them unworthy of funding? And what ethical obligations emerge if known evidence is being ignored or suppressed by institutions claiming authority over historical truth? If this evidence synthesis suggests lost civilizations and suppressed knowledge, the question becomes practical. What should we do differently? How should this change investigation priorities, funding allocation, and institutional approaches to historical research? If the evidence synthesis is correct, vast discoveries remain possible. Underwater archaeological survey of continental shelves, particularly in the Mediterranean and Atlantic, could reveal submerged structures and artifacts. Most ocean floors remain largely unmapped in detail. The technology exists. Modern sonar systems can map underwater topography with remarkable precision. Submersible drones can photograph and document structures at depths that were inaccessible a generation ago. Comprehensive survey is increasingly feasible from a technical standpoint. Discoveries of underwater settlements or structures would revolutionize archaeology and validate the coastal civilization hypothesis. The question isn't whether the technology exists, it's whether resources will be allocated to systematic search. Additionally, sites with access restrictions contain potential evidence that's never been systematically studied. Certain Mediterranean regions remain off-limits to independent researchers. Parts of Egypt's Valley of the Kings are closed to excavation. Restricted Caribbean zones, some controlled by military installations, others by private ownership, haven't received comprehensive archaeological survey. Opening these sites to independent research and formal survey could yield substantial discoveries. The restriction patterns themselves raise questions. Are these sites restricted for legitimate preservation reasons, or are restrictions preventing discoveries that would challenge established narratives? Furthermore, analysis of existing collections for anomalous artifacts might reveal patterns not yet recognized. Museums contain thousands of objects whose provenance and function remain unclear. Items catalogued decades ago using outdated classification systems. Artifacts stored in basement collections that haven't been re-examined with modern analytical techniques. Systematic re-examination with fresh perspectives might identify technological artifacts or evidence of knowledge transmission currently misclassified as decorative objects or religious implements. Archaeological re-examination of sites with new dating techniques could revise chronologies. Some sites might be significantly older than conventional dating suggested. Others might reveal layered occupational histories, indicating continuity of habitation across longer periods than currently assumed. Radiocarbon dating has improved substantially. Ground-penetrating radar reveals subsurface structures without excavation. These tools, applied to sites last studied decades ago, could produce surprising results. The genetic archaeology of ancient populations could trace migrations and identify connections between distant cultures. DNA evidence might reveal unexpected population movements, suggesting knowledge transmission and cultural contact across supposedly isolated regions. Ancient DNA analysis has advanced dramatically in recent years. Applying these techniques systematically to populations from coastal regions could map migration patterns following catastrophic sea level changes. Literary analysis of ancient texts, searching for references to technological systems or advanced knowledge, might clarify what ancient peoples remembered about lost civilizations. What can be extracted from mythology using careful linguistic and comparative analysis? Which elements of flood narratives contain consistent technical details that suggest shared historical memory rather than independent invention? Finally, investigation of Göbekli Tepe and similar sites predating conventional civilization emergence could provide foundational understanding of pre-dynastic human capability. If humans were capable of monumental construction 11,000 years ago, what other capabilities might they have possessed? What knowledge did they accumulate? How was that knowledge preserved and transmitted? These potential discoveries aren't speculative fantasy. They're applications of existing methodologies in contexts where they haven't yet been systematically applied. The discoveries require resources, institutional will, and openness to revising timelines. The reluctance to invest these resources suggests either that institutions are confident no significant revisions will be needed, which implies the evidence synthesis is wrong, or that institutional interests in maintaining established narratives outweigh interest in discovery, which suggests the suppression hypothesis has merit. The discoveries that would confirm everything suggested in this investigation remain undiscovered, not because they don't exist, but because we haven't looked in the right places with genuine commitment to finding them. If these discoveries are possible and valuable, why haven't institutions prioritized them? The answer involves not just institutional inertia, but active choices being made, choices that implicate deeper questions about power, control, and what information certain groups benefit from keeping hidden or compartmentalized. Institutions face a choice point. They can continue protecting established narratives through gatekeeping, refusing to acknowledge anomalies or treating them as isolated curiosities. They can adopt gradual concession, slowly incorporating inconvenient evidence while maintaining core orthodoxy. Or they can provide genuine institutional support for investigating unconventional evidence, committing resources to systematic exploration of hypotheses currently marginalized. Each choice carries consequences. Continued gatekeeping preserves institutional authority in the short term, but risks losing credibility as evidence accumulates outside institutional control. The divergence between mainstream and alternative archaeology will widen, creating two separate knowledge ecosystems with reduced mutual credibility. Eventually, public trust shifts toward alternative channels if those channels consistently identify evidence mainstream institutions dismiss. Gradual concession allows slow incorporation of inconvenient evidence without fundamental revision. Institutions acknowledge specific anomalies while avoiding broader implications. This approach consumes decades while suppressing accelerated investigation. It protects institutional prestige but delays actual discovery. Genuine support for unconventional research carries immediate risks. Institutional authority suffers if findings prove incorrect. Departments that backed failed hypotheses lose credibility. But institutions gain substantial credibility if hypotheses validate. The choice institutions make will partly determine the speed at which genuine historical revision occurs. Currently, institutions trend toward gradual concession with strategic gatekeeping. They acknowledge anomalies while marginalizing their implications. This approach protects institutional authority while managing pressure from evidence accumulation. But it slows discovery and leaves actual investigation to alternative channels, with fewer resources and less access. The optimal outcome for knowledge discovery would involve institutions supporting rigorous investigation of unconventional hypotheses while maintaining critical standards. This requires institutional humility, accepting that established narratives might require fundamental revision. The question is whether institutions possess such humility or whether structural incentives prevent it. The institutions that study our history face a choice: preserve the narratives they've built their authority on, or actually investigate the mysteries they've managed to ignore, and that choice might be the most important decision, determining what humanity discovers about itself. The choice isn't just institutional, it's collective. If mainstream archaeology won't investigate certain questions, alternative channels must. If institutions suppress evidence, distributed networks must preserve it. We're reaching a point where the investigation itself becomes a political and cultural act, not just an academic exercise. Understanding the stakes becomes crucial. The question of lost civilizations isn't purely historical. It carries immediate implications for how we understand ourselves, our capabilities, and our future. If advanced civilizations existed in antiquity and faced catastrophe that destroyed them, what does that suggest about civilizations today? If knowledge can be lost, if technological sophistication can regress, we shouldn't assume progress is inevitable or guaranteed. Modernity treats technological advancement as natural law, each generation building on predecessors' achievements in an unbroken chain stretching toward infinite improvement. But if Atlantean civilization possessed knowledge we've lost, if sophisticated systems collapsed, leaving only fragments for later cultures to rediscover, then progress is reversible. This isn't cause for despair, but for realism. Recognizing that sophisticated systems can collapse focuses attention on what makes civilizations vulnerable and what protections might prevent recurrence. The ancient flood myths, preserved for thousands of years across cultures, might represent warnings about recurring catastrophe rather than primitive explanations for natural phenomena. The cyclical time frameworks in Hindu and Mesoamerican cosmology, ages of rise and fall, creation and destruction might encode genuine recognition of systemic vulnerability rather than mystical speculation. Understanding this reframes how we should approach environmental concerns. If sea level rise threatened advanced coastal civilizations before, it should concern us now. The evidence of advanced civilizations destroyed by environmental catastrophe becomes case study in how rapidly civilization can be displaced by natural forces. This isn't abstract historical interest. It's pattern recognition with present moment implications. Similarly, if knowledge was preserved through monuments, myths, and intentional encoding, we should consider how we're encoding knowledge for future generations. Are we building monuments that will outlast digital storage? Are we creating redundancies, ensuring crucial knowledge survives catastrophe? Modern civilization's dependence on digital infrastructure creates vulnerability unknown in antiquity. Electromagnetic pulse events, solar flares, cyber warfare, or other disruptions could eliminate digital infrastructure globally, leaving surviving humans without access to technological knowledge. The ancient emphasis on physical encoding monuments, stone records, symbolic knowledge preserved in mythology might be wisdom worth reconsidering. Furthermore, if advanced ancient peoples possessed technological knowledge, and that knowledge was lost and rediscovered piecemeal through history, we should consider what knowledge might remain undiscovered or suppressed that could benefit us. Ancient texts might encode technical information we're only now sophisticated enough to recognize. Ancient structures might be devices or systems we don't yet understand. The question isn't whether we should become superstitious about ancient wisdom, but whether we should systematically investigate whether ancient peoples understood certain domains better than we do. Finally, if lost civilizations represent part of our actual history, acknowledging that history becomes personally and culturally significant, we don't just study history abstractly, we identify with it. Knowing that advanced civilizations existed in our past, that knowledge transmission and catastrophic loss are genuine patterns in human experience, that we might be repeating cyclical mistakes, this changes how we see ourselves in time. We're not the pinnacle of human achievement, but part of a longer pattern with past peaks we've forgotten and future vulnerabilities we're not adequately addressing. If Atlantis wasn't just history, but prophecy, if the pattern of rise and fall, advancement and catastrophe is recurring through time, then what we do in the next decades isn't just about progress. It's about survival. The historical implications are profound, but they're only the beginning. The evidence of suppression, the patterns of institutional gatekeeping, the resistance to acknowledging inconvenient history, these have present moment implications about control and power. If knowledge of lost civilizations is being suppressed or compartmentalized, the question becomes, who benefits from that suppression? And who has the power to suppress information at scale? These aren't paranoid questions, they're basic power analysis. Historically, controlling narrative has been central to maintaining power. Colonizers rewrote history to justify colonization, framing conquered peoples as primitive and conquest as civilizing mission. Empires suppressed information about sophisticated predecessors to legitimate their own authority as representing historical pinnacle. Governments classify information to maintain strategic advantage, controlling what populations know about capabilities, vulnerabilities, and historical precedents. In contemporary contexts, powerful institutions benefit from historical narratives that legitimize their authority. If archaeological evidence suggests civilizations far more advanced than ancient Greece or Rome, questions arise about the foundations of Western intellectual authority. If non-Western civilizations achieved greater sophistication than Eurocentric history admits, the narrative justifying Western cultural dominance becomes harder to sustain. If technology can be lost and regained, the assumption that modern societies possess inevitable superior understanding becomes questionable. If ancient peoples possessed knowledge we don't, modernity's claim to represent historical apex collapses. These aren't abstract academic concerns, they're about power and legitimacy. Controlling historical narrative remains valuable for maintaining contemporary authority structures. The suppression of history isn't necessarily coordinated conspiracy, but serves structural interests regardless of conscious coordination. Institutions benefit from narratives justifying their present authority. Universities gain credibility from being gatekeepers of valid historical knowledge. Governments benefit from narratives supporting contemporary political arrangements and national myths. Corporations benefit from narratives suggesting contemporary technology represents inevitable progress, rather than fragile systems easily disrupted by catastrophe. The question becomes, what would change if populations recognized that advanced civilizations fell, that knowledge was lost, that progress is reversible, that institutions might be protecting false narratives? People might demand different priorities from governments. They might invest in knowledge preservation differently, building physical redundancies rather than trusting digital infrastructure. They might approach environmental concerns with greater urgency, understanding that catastrophic sea level change has destroyed civilizations before. They might question institutional authority more rigorously, recognizing that expert consensus can be systematically wrong for generations. They might support research agendas institutions currently resist, funding alternative archaeology through direct channels that bypass institutional gatekeeping. The resistance to acknowledging lost civilizations might reflect not intellectual integrity, but institutional self-preservation. If this is correct, accepting alternative historical narratives becomes politically threatening to power structures invested in conventional timelines. Understanding this changes how we interpret institutional resistance. It's not just inertia or epistemic conservatism. It's active protection of politically useful narratives. This doesn't mean alternative narratives are automatically correct, simply because institutions resist them. Institutional resistance doesn't validate claims. But it does mean those claims are being evaluated in context of institutional interests, rather than purely on intellectual merit. Evidence gets filtered through political considerations before reaching academic assessment. Recognizing this allows more sophisticated understanding of what evidence is being suppressed and why, and allows individuals to support investigation regardless of institutional resistance. History isn't just intellectual puzzle, it's political arena where narrative control translates to present power, which might explain why certain historical questions trigger such fierce institutional resistance. Understanding that historical narratives connect to present power structures raises ethical questions about what we should do with suppressed evidence, and whether we have obligations to pursue investigation institutions resist, and what those obligations might require of us. If the evidence synthesis presented across this investigation is persuasive, and if suppression of historical truth serves institutional interests over collective knowledge, what obligations follow? The question isn't abstract. It requires consideration of personal and collective responsibility. At individual level, you might research further, examining primary sources and evaluating evidence independently, rather than accepting institutional pronouncements. You might support alternative researchers through crowdfunding, media engagement, or direct financial contribution to expeditions institutions won't fund. You might demand institutional openness, asking universities and museums to justify restrictions on site access, and explain why certain research questions receive no funding. Or you might simply accept that uncertainty about history requires intellectual humility, avoiding confident assertions about what definitely happened, and remaining open to revision as new evidence emerges. At collective level, communities might support funding for independent archaeology, creating research foundations that bypass institutional gatekeeping. They might develop alternative research institutions with different incentive structures, where career advancement doesn't depend on conformity to established narratives. They might pressure established institutions to investigate restricted sites and publish anomalous findings, demanding transparency about what evidence exists and why certain interpretations are dismissed. These aren't revolutionary demands. They're straightforward calls for rigorous investigation and transparent evidence evaluation. They're requests that institutions justify their gatekeeping and demonstrate that restrictions on research serve legitimate purposes rather than narrative protection. They're suggestions that communities with resources direct some support toward questions institutions won't investigate. At civilizational level, accepting that previous civilizations possessed knowledge we've lost should motivate urgency about preserving knowledge we currently possess. How are we encoding knowledge for future generations? What happens if digital infrastructure fails? Have we built enough redundancy into crucial information systems? What knowledge preservation should be prioritized? These questions matter, regardless of whether Atlantis existed as specific civilization. They matter because we know civilizations can fail, and knowledge can be lost. The historical evidence, even disputing Atlantis' existence, teaches that urgency. The investigation into lost civilizations, properly understood, isn't escape into fantasy or rejection of science. It's rigorous examination of evidence, honest acknowledgement of uncertainty, and commitment to discovering truth, even when that truth challenges institutions we depend on. It's also recognition that our future security partly depends on learning from history, on understanding what made prior civilizations vulnerable, and what we should do differently. Whether or not Atlantis existed as specific civilization, the pattern it represents, advanced civilization, environmental vulnerability, knowledge loss remains genuinely relevant to our present moment and future survival. The investigation into lost civilizations isn't a historical puzzle, it's call to responsibility. How will we preserve what we know, learn from what was lost, and ensure we don't repeat the mistakes that destroyed our predecessors? After examining evidence from every angle, geological, archaeological, mythological, institutional, and political, we arrive at the final question. What is Atlantis, really? And does it matter whether it existed as specific civilization or represents pattern we need to recognize and respond to? Throughout this investigation, we've examined evidence, institutional resistance, and suppressed history. We've considered whether specific sunken continents might exist beneath ocean waves, and whether ancient civilizations possessed anomalous knowledge modern archaeology can't explain. But the final question, what is Atlantis, requires stepping back from details to recognize larger pattern. Atlantis might be Minoan civilization, destroyed by volcanic catastrophe when Thera exploded in the second millennium before our era. It might be coastal settlements submerged by rising seas at the end of the last ice age, cities built on shorelines that no longer exist. It might be cultural memory of the Younger Dryas catastrophe, when rapid climate change disrupted emerging civilizations across multiple continents. It might be philosophical allegory Plato created without historical reference, a thought experiment about ideal society and its corruption. Or it might be exactly what Plato claimed, advanced civilization destroyed in catastrophe, now unknown, because it rests underwater beyond our systematic investigation. The specific answer matters less than recognizing what Atlantis represents. The vulnerability of civilizations to catastrophe. The possibility of knowledge loss on massive scale. The pattern of cultural amnesia following disasters that kill populations and destroy records. The persistence of memory and myths across cultures that had no documented contact. Whether Atlantis was one city or many, whether it existed precisely as Plato described or inspired his description, the core truth remains. Advanced civilizations have disappeared from historical record. Knowledge has been lost, and we've forgotten more than we remember. That truth finds support in geological evidence of climate change and sea level rise that destroyed coastal regions. In archaeological anomalies we haven't adequately explained with conventional timelines. In universal mythology, too consistent across isolated cultures to be coincidence. In monuments encoding knowledge, we can't entirely decipher, despite our technological sophistication. This constitutes genuine historical mystery we should take seriously, rather than dismissing as fantasy. Atlantis, in this understanding, represents both specific historical question and universal pattern. It's the name we give to catastrophe and forgetting. It's the symbol of heights achieved and heights lost. It's what we might become if we fail to learn from history's pattern civilizations that rose to sophistication, failed to adapt to changing conditions, and vanished, leaving only fragments for later peoples to puzzle over. The question isn't strictly whether Atlantis existed as a specific place at specific coordinates. The question is whether we're willing to recognize patterns of vulnerability and learn from them, or whether we'll repeat the pattern ourselves. That question is entirely contemporary and entirely practical. It determines not what happened thousands of years ago, but what happens next. How we prepare for environmental change. How we preserve knowledge against catastrophe. How seriously we take warnings encoded in ancient texts and structures. Whether we investigate suppressed evidence or accept institutional narratives uncritically. Atlantis might not be a specific place. It might be a warning encoded in mythology and archaeology, preserved across millennia, waiting for someone to finally understand what it's trying to tell us. If Atlantis represents both historical question and warning pattern, the final piece is recognizing what we're being warned about, what the convergence of ancient evidence is actually trying to communicate across thousands of years. The universal preservation of flood mythology, the encoding of knowledge in monuments, the cyclical time frameworks, the emphasis on preserving wisdom across generations, these suggest that ancient peoples understood something we've forgotten. They understood that civilizations are vulnerable. They understood that catastrophe can be rapid and total. They understood that knowledge, once lost, is difficult to recover. And they responded by building redundancies. Myths that would preserve memory across generations, even when written records were destroyed. Monuments that would outlast civilizations, encoding mathematical and astronomical knowledge in structure and proportion, so that survivors or descendants could recover what was lost. Multiple encoding methods, ensuring that at least some information would survive whatever came next. Why would they invest such extraordinary resources in preservation if they didn't believe catastrophe was recurring rather than unique? Why would multiple isolated cultures develop nearly identical warning narratives about destructive floods if they weren't responding to actual catastrophic threats? The ancient world's emphasis on preparation and preservation suggests lived experience of vulnerability. The modern world, by contrast, has largely abandoned this orientation. We trust digital systems and assume continuity. We've stopped building monuments and started deleting records to save storage space. We've abandoned cyclical time frameworks and committed entirely to linear progress. We've assumed that knowledge acquisition is unidirectional and irreversible, that once discovered, information stays discovered. If ancient peoples were correct that catastrophe recurs, we've positioned ourselves perfectly for maximum vulnerability. We've centralized knowledge in systems that could be disrupted by electromagnetic pulse, solar flare, cyber warfare, or infrastructure collapse. We've abandoned redundancies in favor of efficiency. We've assumed our technology is robust when it might be extraordinarily fragile. We've built complex systems that, when they fail catastrophically rather than gracefully. A medieval village losing its mill could rebuild. A modern city losing its electrical grid faces total systems collapse. The warning encoded in Atlantis mythology isn't ancient people had civilizations we don't know about. It's civilizations are fragile, knowledge is precious, and catastrophe is recurring. The modern dismissal of this warning as superstition might itself be the fundamental mistake. Not the superstition of believing ancient myths literally and uncritically, but the superstition of believing we've transcended vulnerability that affects all civilizations across all time periods. Understanding Atlantis as warning requires taking seriously what ancient peoples understood through hard experience. That knowledge preservation matters because knowledge can be lost. That complexity creates vulnerability as much as capability. That redundancy and resilience matter more than optimization and efficiency. This has immediate practical implications. How are we preserving crucial knowledge against catastrophic disruption? How are we ensuring systems don't become fragile through over-optimization? How are we building redundancy into knowledge and infrastructure systems? How are we teaching next generations that civilizations can fall and that the patterns of history include regression as well as progress? The question isn't whether to believe literally in Atlantis, a specific historical place. The question is whether to learn from the warning it represents. Whether as historical fact or philosophical parable, the message is identical. Remember that what rises can fall, What we know can be forgotten, and what we build can be destroyed. Respond accordingly. The most ancient warning humanity preserved across millennia is that catastrophe recurs and that knowledge is fragile. A warning we've dismissed as superstition precisely when we've made ourselves most vulnerable to having it prove true. If the warning is real and we're finally ready to listen, what does that require? Not belief in specific historical narratives necessarily, but genuine recalibration of how we approach knowledge, institutions, and future. We end where we began with mystery. Whether Atlantis existed as Plato described, whether advanced civilizations thrived in now submerged regions, whether knowledge was transmitted across cultures through survivor populations, these remain unresolved questions. The evidence suggests possibilities, but doesn't provide certainty. The institutional resistance prevents definitive investigation. The underwater sites remain mostly unexplored. The restricted locations stay restricted. The anomalies persist without adequate explanation. But the investigation has revealed something more important than answering these specific questions. It's revealed our capacity for investigation and our institutional resistance to it. We've discovered suppression and gatekeeping, not necessarily as conspiracy, but as structural feature of how knowledge systems operate. We found that evidence doesn't always flow transparently through institutions claiming authority over truth. We've learned that we can investigate, question, and pursue truth even when institutions discourage it. Most importantly, we've recognized that history is still being written, and that what we choose to investigate, preserve, and teach shapes what future generations understand about our time and theirs. The choice before us is whether to continue accepting institutional narratives without questioning anomalies, or whether to support rigorous investigation of questions institutions avoid, whether to preserve knowledge only digitally or build redundancy and physical preservation systems that might outlast catastrophe, whether to approach civilization with confidence in inevitable progress or realism about vulnerability and the possibility of collapse, whether to listen to what ancient peoples were trying to tell us through mythology and monuments, or dismiss it as primitive superstition. These choices aren't abstract. They determine what knowledge gets preserved, what history gets investigated, and what warnings get heeded. They determine whether we learn from the pattern Atlantis represents, or repeat it ourselves. The investigation into lost civilizations ultimately is investigation into ourselves. Who we are, what we're capable of, what we're willing to learn, and what we're willing to protect against future loss. The mysteries remain. The questions persist. But the capacity to investigate them, the choice to take evidence seriously despite institutional resistance, the commitment to knowledge preservation despite our vulnerability, these are within reach. Whether Atlantis exists as specific sunken continent matters less than whether we possess the wisdom to heed the warning it represents. That choice, ultimately, belongs to us. The mystery of Atlantis isn't solved, but something more valuable has been revealed. The recognition that what we choose to investigate, preserve, and pass forward will define what humanity becomes.